Just the wheelchair guy. That's what they called him. Not with malice exactly, but with a kind of casual dismissal that hurt more than any insult could. George Thompson, 72 years old, had been working as a PRM assistant at London Heathrow Airport's Terminal 5 for 8 years. PRM stood for Passengers with Reduced Mobility, which was corporate speak for the elderly, the disabled, and anyone who needed help getting from point A to point B in one of the world's busiest airports. George wore the standard Heathrow uniform, a blue polo shirt with the airport logo, dark trousers, and comfortable shoes that had seen better days. His hair was completely white, cut short and practical. His face was lined with age, his hands spotted and weathered, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints didn't quite work the way they used to. To the thousands of passengers who passed through Terminal 5 every day, he was invisible. Just another airport worker. Just the wheelchair guy. Emily Carter, 26 years old and recently promoted to Border Force Supervisor, certainly saw him that way. It was a Thursday morning, just past 6 a.m., and the departures hall was already filling with the pre-dawn rush of business travelers and families heading off on holiday. Emily approached George with her tablet in hand, her face set in that particular expression of professional annoyance that young managers often wore when dealing with older employees. "George, morning," she said, not quite looking at him. "Listen, I've had another complaint. A passenger said you took too long getting them to their gate. Said you stopped to chat with security." George looked up from the wheelchair he was checking. "Mrs. Patterson. She's 87. First time flying alone since her husband passed. She needed a moment." Emily sighed. "Granddad, I get it. You're kind. But we have targets. Efficiency metrics. The new digital tracking system launches next month, and honestly, you might want to consider full retirement. I'm just saying." The word granddad wasn't said with affection. It was a label, a box, a way of saying you're obsolete. "I'll think about it," George said quietly. Emily softened slightly. "Look, you're lovely, really. But times have changed. We've got AI surveillance now, biometric scanners, real-time threat assessment algorithms. We don't need—" She trailed off, realizing how that sentence was going to end. "Old men pushing wheelchairs?" George finished for her, a small smile on his face. Emily looked uncomfortable. "I didn't mean it like that." "I understand, Emily," George said. "I'll do better." Emily walked away, already absorbed in her tablet. George returned to his wheelchair, running his hands over the handles, checking the brakes. 30 years ago, he'd done very different work. Work that couldn't be discussed. Work that had taken him to every corner of the globe. Work that had earned him commendations he'd never been able to show anyone. But that was a lifetime ago. Now he pushed wheelchairs, and that was fine. Service was service, no matter the form it took. The airport's public address system crackled to life. "Good morning, passengers. This is a security announcement. Please do not leave baggage unattended at any time. Report any suspicious behavior to airport staff immediately." George had heard that announcement 10,000 times, but unlike most people, he actually listened. Old habits died hard. His eyes, even at 72, were sharp. They moved constantly, scanning the crowds with a practiced efficiency that looked casual but was anything but. Pattern recognition, behavioral analysis, threat assessment, skills that had been drilled into him over 3 decades of service as a UK Sky Marshal, flying on commercial flights, protecting passengers who never knew he was there. In the arrivals hall, 2 men caught his attention. Not because they looked dangerous, they didn't. They were in their early 30s, well-dressed in business casual attire, each carrying a small rolling suitcase and a backpack. Perfectly normal. Except they weren't. George noticed the way they moved. They'd arrived on separate flights but were now moving through the terminal in a coordinated pattern. Not together, never acknowledging each other, but their timing was too precise. One would pause at an information board while the other bought a bottle of water. Then they'd switch. One would check his phone while the other walked past a security camera, his body angled just slightly to obscure his face. George had seen this before. Counter-surveillance behavior, operational discipline. He was supposed to be meeting a passenger, an elderly gentleman coming in from Dubai who needed assistance to his connecting flight. but his eyes kept drifting back to the two men. They were good, very good, but George had spent 30 years identifying people who were trying not to be identified. The two men whose names George would later learn were Malik and Yusuf moved toward the security checkpoint for departures. They went through separate lanes, never looking at each other. George watched as they both cleared security without incident and disappeared into the departures lounge. He should let it go. He was a wheelchair assistant. This wasn't his job anymore. But instinct was a difficult thing to ignore. George completed his current assignment, then made his way to the departures area. He had access. Airport staff could move through most areas of the terminal. He spotted the two men again. They were in the main departures lounge now, sitting at different gates. Gate B18 and B22. Adjacent gates, but not the same. They were both waiting, both calm, both checking their phones periodically, and both carrying identical backpacks. Not the rolling suitcases they'd had before. Those must have been checked. No, these were new. Well, not new. Expensive technical hiking backpacks. Same brand, different colors. One navy blue, one dark green. George felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He made his way back to the security area where Emily was stationed, reviewing passenger manifests on her tablet. "Emily," he said quietly. "Quick word." She looked up, already annoyed. "George, I'm swamped. What is it?" Two men, 30s, business casual, identical backpacks. They arrived separately, but they're moving in coordination. They just went through security. I think you should pull them aside for secondary screening. Emily stared at him. "And you think this because—" Their behavior, the timing of their movements, the fact that they're clearly trained in counter-surveillance? Emily laughed, but not unkindly. "Grandad, matching backpacks isn't a threat indicator. Half of London bought those bags last month. They're on sale at every outdoor shop in the country." "It's not just the bags," George pressed. "Their movements. The way they're coordinating without communicating." "Emily, I've seen this before." Emily's expression shifted to something closer to pity. "George, we have actual intelligence briefings, real threats. If Counterterrorism Command thought there was something, we'd know. We use data now. Algorithms, behavioral analytics software." "I've been doing behavioral analytics since before it had a name," George said, his voice still calm but firmer now. "That was a long time ago, Granddad," Emily said gently. "Things have changed. Look, I'll note your concern in the system, but I can't pull passengers based on a feeling. That's not how we work anymore." George wanted to tell her about the flights, about the operations, about the 3 decades he'd spent as one of the silent guardians of British aviation security. But pride wasn't the point. Results were. "Just keep an eye on them," he said. "Please." "I will," Emily said, already turning back to her tablet. "But George, seriously, maybe take your break. You seem stressed." George walked away, but he didn't take a break. He went back to the departures lounge, positioning himself with a wheelchair at a maintenance station that gave him a clear view of both gates. He pretended to check the chair's mechanisms while his eyes never left the two men. At 10:30 a.m., Malik stood up and walked toward the restrooms. 2 minutes later, Yusuf did the same. George's pulse, which had been steady for the past hour, kicked up a notch. Meeting point. He moved closer to the restrooms, positioning himself at a nearby charging station where travelers plugged in their devices. He appeared to be checking his phone, the old flip phone that made some of the younger staff laugh, but his attention was entirely on the restroom entrance. 5 minutes later, both men emerged. They walked in opposite directions, back toward their respective gates. But George noticed immediately. They'd swapped backpacks. Malik now had the dark green one. Yusuf had the navy blue. Content exchange. Classic tradecraft for keeping security from tracking a single package. George's hands were shaking slightly as he pulled out his phone. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline of recognition. He'd been right. He scrolled through his contacts to a number he hadn't called in 3 years. Commander Helen Ashworth, Counter-Terrorism Command, New Scotland Yard. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Ashworth." "Helen, it's George Thompson." There was a pause, then her voice changed, becoming warmer. "George." "Bloody hell, it's been years. You all right?" Helen, I'm at Heathrow Terminal 5. I need you to listen carefully. Her tone shifted instantly to professional alertness. I'm listening. George described everything he'd seen in precise detail. The coordinated arrival, the counter-surveillance behavior, the identical backpacks, the exchange in the restroom. Helen listened without interrupting. George, she said when he finished, why are you telling me this? You're retired. I work here now. Passenger assistance. There was a long pause. You're pushing wheelchairs at Heathrow? It's honest work, George said simply. Helen, I know what I saw. This is real. I trust you, she said immediately. I'm sending a team. ETA 15 minutes. George, do not engage. Observe only. Understood? Understood. And George, if you're right about this, you just saved a lot of lives. George hung up and returned to his observation point. 15 minutes. He could keep eyes on them for 15 minutes. But at 10:55 a.m., both men stood up simultaneously. Boarding had begun at both gates. They were going to get on their planes. George's mind raced. If they boarded, it would be over. Separate flights, separate bombs, coordinated detonations. Classic methodology. The counterterrorism team was still 10 minutes out. Protocol said wait. Protocol said observe only. Protocol said don't engage. But George had also learned over 30 years of service that sometimes protocol wasn't enough. Sometimes you had to act. He grabbed his wheelchair and moved quickly toward gate B18, where Malik was queuing to board. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. Excuse me. Sir, George called out loudly. Sir, you dropped something. Malik turned, confused. George was pointing at the ground near Malik's feet. Your phone. I think it fell out of your pocket. Malik looked down. There was nothing there. I didn't drop anything, he said coldly. Oh, my mistake, George said, looking genuinely confused and apologetic. Terribly sorry. My eyes aren't what they used to be. It was a small delay, maybe 20 seconds. But the gate agent had paused the boarding process, confused by the disruption. George did the same thing at gate B22, approaching Yusuf with the same concerned announcement about a dropped item. Another 20-second delay. Emily Carter saw him and came rushing over, her face flushed with anger. George, she hissed, what are you doing? Buying time, he said calmly. For what? At that moment, the main entrance to the departures lounge burst open. 6 officers from the Metropolitan Police's Counterterrorism Command entered at a run, wearing tactical vests and carrying MP5 submachine guns. Armed police, the lead officer shouted. Nobody move! The terminal erupted into chaos. Passengers screamed, dropped to the ground, grabbed their children. But the officers moved with precision, heading straight for the 2 gates. Malik and Yusuf saw them coming. For a split second, both men looked at each other across the terminal, the first time they'd acknowledged each other's existence. Then they both bolted in opposite directions. They didn't get far. More officers poured in from other entrances. Within 30 seconds, both men were face down on the floor, hands cuffed behind their backs. The backpacks were carefully removed and placed in blast containment units. The bomb disposal team arrived 7 minutes later. George stood off to the side, trying to be invisible again, trying to just be the wheelchair guy. But Emily was staring at him, her face pale with shock. Commander Helen Ashworth arrived 20 minutes later, striding through the still chaotic terminal with the confidence of someone who'd seen worse. She spotted George immediately and walked straight to him. George! Helen! She lowered her voice. Explosive components in both bags, not fully assembled. They were planning to do that mid-flight, probably in the lavatories. Separate planes, coordinated detonations over the Atlantic. We're looking at 800 potential casualties if both planes had gone down. George nodded. He felt very tired suddenly. You stopped a major terrorist attack, Helen continued. You saved hundreds of lives. I just pushed wheelchairs, George said quietly. Helen smiled, but her eyes were serious. Bollocks. You're still the best observer I've ever worked with. She turned to Emily, who was standing nearby, still in shock. Your border force? Helen asked. Emily nodded, unable to speak. Do you know who this man is? Emily shook her head. This is George Thompson, UK Sky Marshal for 30 years. He flew more than 10,000 operational flights. He personally stopped 4 hijacking attempts. He trained half of my aviation security unit. He's a legend. Emily looked at George, and tears started rolling down her face. I called you Granddad, she whispered. I told you that you were too slow. I almost let those men get on those planes because I wouldn't listen to you. George put a gentle hand on her shoulder. You're a good officer, Emily. You care about people. You just need to learn that experience and technology work best together. Neither one alone is enough. Will you stay? She asked. Will you teach me? George thought about it. He thought about retirement, about finally resting. But he also thought about all the passengers who would walk through this terminal tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. Passengers who deserve protection, whether they knew it or not. I'll stay, he said, but I'm still pushing wheelchairs. I like it. 2 weeks later, there was a small ceremony at Heathrow. Not public, security reasons. The commissioner of the Metropolitan Police was there, along with representatives from MI5 and the British Airports Authority. They gave George a commendation that he would never be allowed to display publicly. After the ceremony, George returned to Terminal 5. He had a shift to work. But this time, Emily was with him, learning, watching how he watched, learning to see what algorithms couldn't see. That man over there, George said quietly as they stood in the arrivals hall. By the 3rd column, watch his eyes. Emily watched. He's scanning the exits. Exactly. Could be nothing. Nervous flyer. But we watch. We don't assume. We observe. The camera pulls back, showing the vast expanse of Heathrow Terminal 5. Thousands of passengers moving through, unaware, safe, protected by people they'd never notice, doing jobs they'd never consider important. George Thompson's story reminds us that heroes don't always announce themselves with uniforms or titles. Sometimes they wear blue polo shirts and comfortable shoes. Sometimes they push wheelchairs through busy terminals. Sometimes they're dismissed as too old, too slow, relics of a world that's moved on without them. But true vigilance doesn't retire. It doesn't fade with age or relevance. It simply finds new ways to serve. And the greatest guardians among us are often the ones we overlook every single day until the moment arrives when we need them most. Then, and only then, do we see them for what they truly are. What would you have done in George's position? Would you have trusted your instincts, or would you have waited for permission that might never come? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story of quiet courage moved you, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Valor Chronicles for more stories of unsung heroes who walk among us. Thank you for watching.